and we may not get through all of them, and that's okay. Just kind of give you an idea. So one thing, we think about the totality of what we've covered so far this semester, right? We start off with these ideas of who African people were, ontological understandings of what they've done, right? So we're going to kind of continue that conversation a little bit further, and talk about how does a people who has looked at as gods, right, by not only within their own community, but globally, what is going on? How do they go from being viewed as gods to being placed in this institution of enslavement? I don't know what's going on with the slide. So we're going to look at just some images of how the world identified as African individuals as gods, right? So a picture of Imhotep, who we know was elevated to a god status through his achievements. This is a picture of the Buddha. It's zoomed in because I want you guys to pay attention to the nose and to the lips, right? Those are purely African features. You look at the broadness of the nose, you look at the broadness of the lips. I think in this course, we discussed how the 21 gun salute, when, what's his name? Napoleon came to the Ahram Akhet, or the Sphinx. He's seen the magnificence of it. He's seen the African features and blew the nose and lips off. These same nose and same lips are featured here on this image of the Buddha. Some more images of the Buddha. Again, you just to accentuate those lips. Also pay attention to the hair, right? Look at the kinks of the hair. Very similar to what they call Bantu knots in a lot of African culture. Another image of the Buddha. This really accentuates the hair and the Bantu knots here. This is Thailand, 800 AD. Some more images. I'm trying to move it kind of quickly just because for the sake of time, right? These are some Ethiopian depictions of divinity, right? These are found in a lot of the museums in Cairo. A lot of the Coptic images of Christ are depicted like this in ancient times, right? This is where it gets a little interesting. So these are all depictions of ancient Kemetic deities, right? And you notice the hat. Let me try to, hold on 1 second. Let me move this out the way. I don't know if you guys can see this. All right, there, absolutely. Okay. So you notice the image of the hats are the same, right? But I want you to point out in your upper right-hand corner, where is that hat? Where have you guys seen that at? In your upper right-hand corner.
The Pope.
The Pope, right? Very similar to these Kemetics that you see here rocking the same hat, right? It gets deeper. Images of the Mary and the baby Jesus, right? These are all held in these European museums. These are all held at the Vatican. You notice the image of their skin, right? Very dark features, very black, right? This is not happenstance, this is intentional. By and large, these images were recognized as Black and African individuals, right? Here you see a modern day image of the Pope. I believe this was taken in 2017. If you look at what they're praying to, it's an image of the Black Madonna and Black Jesus, right? So even in the modern contemporary context, there's this understanding of the origins of these deities as African. So here's some more African depictions of deities. Abutala. This is from the Ifa and Akan tradition. Yeminya, goddess of beauty. Oshun, goddess of the ocean. Shango, the god of war and iron. Says his voice was like thunder. Another image of Shango. So the question is, how do we go from the world identifying African peoples as gods to being okay with enslaving these same individuals, right? And a lot of this is situated in this idea or this edict called the Papal Bull, which took place in 1452, where the Catholic Church and the Pope Nicholas V, they said that we will go out throughout the world and enslave what they would call heathen people or pagan people who do not live and believe in the Catholic religion, right? So this was the edict that went out that allowed the shift to take place between African peoples being viewed as something of to be looked up to be admired, to being okay with being able to place them into enslavement, right? So this is one of the first dominoes to fall, if you will, to kind of make that transition. So it has been argued, and it has made the claim in this text, Capitalism and Slavery, that the first stock in the New York Stock Exchange, the first stock in this American system is enslaved Africans, right? That's the first commodity to be traded on Wall Street, if you will. There's also the history that Wall Street, Central Park, those were built on former enslaved communities as well as former enslaved graveyards, right? So also Wall Street was one of the auction blocks that took place in New York. So when Africans were brought to New York in particular, where the area of Wall Street served in its origin as an auction block, right? So again, this notion of the first commodity being African individuals in this United States is not far off. So we'll get into some, I'm not gonna be able to bear with me because I gotta close this out so I can see the whole text. So, all right. So please stop me if you guys have any questions, because now I can't see you at all. All right. So it says slavery was an economic institution, first and foremost. It had been the basic of the Greek economy and had built the Roman Empire. In modern times, it provided sugar and tea and coffee for the Western world. It produced the cotton to serve as the basis for modern capitalism. It made the American South and the Caribbean islands. Think about glissant. Seen in historical perspective, it forms a part of the general picture of the harsh treatment of the underprivileged class. So what that is saying, right? This institution of enslavement was the impetus for the ability to treat lower class people, maybe whether it be financially or whatever the case may be, harshly, right? This is the impetus for that idea and that notion. The unsymptomatic poor laws and served feudal laws and their indifference with which the rising capitalist class was beginning to reckon prosperity in terms of pound and sterlings, right? So essentially what they're saying is they had no sympathy for the lower feudal class, right? They had no sympathy for the lower class, right? Because as they're suffering, those in power are accumulating riches and wealth, right? And becoming used to the idea, this is where it gets important, they're becoming used to the idea of sacrificing human life to the deity, right? And think about how I've used deity so far throughout the semester, right? We talked about Ma'at as a deity, right? You talked about Imhotep because of his acts on the world allowed him to be elevated to God status to become a deity, right? Capital, in this context, Eric Williams is using the deity of increased production, right? So the God of this world, of this society, is the accumulation of capital, right? The increase of production. So we're going to shift to slavery in the Caribbean. So slavery in the Caribbean has been too narrowly identified with the Negro. A racist twist has thereby been given to what is basically an economic phenomenon. This is what we talked about last week. Slavery was not born of racism, rather racism was the consequence of slavery. Unfree labor in the New World was brown, white, black, yellow, Catholic, and Protestant, right? So they're saying that this settles the debate whether was slavery born out of racism or was racism born out of slavery, right? Eric Williams asserts that racism was born out of slavery. Racism is the justification for enslavement, right? Think back to the Papal Bull. We talked about this being a Catholic institution that set this in place, right? This is a religious entity, right? So when you think about religious entities, right, they should be about treating humanity kindly, right? It should be about doing for the less fortunate, right? These are the lessons and the teachings of Jesus, right? So how can a religious institution justify taking a group of people and placing them in this institution of enslavement, right? The justification comes that these individuals are inhuman, right? So that's how racism is born out of enslavement. It's the justification for their heinous acts. The Spaniard discovers that one Negro is worth 4 Indians. A prominent official in Hispaniola insisted in 1518 that permission to be given to bring Negroes as a race for robust labor. Instead of natives, so weak they can only be employed in tasks requiring little endurance, such as taking care of the field or farm. So again, think about how we talked about last week. I mentioned that for the natives, this may have been a tactic of subversion, right? So we're going to make ourselves appear so weak that we can't do the work, so they will no longer rely on us to do the work. But what becomes important, the Spaniards realized that Africans were able to do about 4 times the work. So wait, essentially what this is saying is one African will be able to do the work of 4 Native Americans, right? Or 4 indigenous people. So by and large, the African was more profitable. So the immediate successor of the Indian, and this is what we mentioned last week as well, however, was not the Negro, but the poor white. These white servants included a variety of types. Some were indentured servants, so-called because before departure from the homeland, they had signed a contract indented by law, binding them to service for a stipulated time and return for their passage. So you leave the homeland, you leave Europe, you will serve as a servant for a period of time. Others were convicts sent out by the deliberate policy of the home government to serve a specified period. So again, even the convicts, when they were sent to the Americas from Europe, they had a limited time of their servitude, right? A proposal made in 1664 would have banished to the colonies all vagrants, rogues, and idlers, petty thieves, gypsies, and loose persons frequenting unlicensed brothels, right? So these are the people who would be sent away. Vagrants, rogues, idlers, petty thieves, gypsies, and people who ran hoe houses, right? That's what a brothel is. A pious petition in 1667 prayed for transportation instead of the death sentence for a wife convicted of stealing goods valued at 3 shillings. In 1745, transportation was the penalty for theft of a silver spoon, a gold watch. So something as simple as stealing a silver spoon or stealing a gold watch will get you deported out of Europe to the Americas. 1 year after the emancipation of Negro slaves, transportation was the penalty for trade union activity. So if they find you engaging in the trade union, that could get you shipped out as well. It's difficult to resist the conclusion that there was some connection between the law and the labor needs of the plantations. And the marvel is that so few people ended up in the colonies overseas. So what they're saying is around this time, laws were being instituted to feed the plantation economy, right? They were creating laws to get people out of Europe, to get them to the Americas, to get them to work the plantation system. And he's saying the marvel is there were not more people who ended up in the colonies overseas, right? So it's a surprise that more people weren't forced to go to the Americas because of these laws that were being instituted. Is there any questions, any comments as I'm moving through this?
No.
Okay. So here comes an important piece, right? Here, then, is the origin of Negro slavery. The reason was economic, not racial. It had to do not with the color of the laborer, but the cheapness of the laborer. As compared with the Indian and white labor, Negro slavery was immensely superior. In each case, This is a writer, Bassett, who chronicled the transition, the plantation system. Bassett writes, discussing North Carolina, it was the survival of the fittest. Both Indian slavery and white servitude, notice the difference, right? Indian slavery and white servitude. So Indian slavery, that is an ontological understanding, right? They understand Indians to be slaves, right? But for the whites, that's a servitude, that's a condition that serves for a moment of time, right? Were to go down before the Black man's superior endurance. Now this docility, I put that in parentheses because I don't necessarily agree with this notion of docility. Who could tell me what docility means? When I say someone is docile, what does that mean?
Maybe less aggressive, less fight. They tend to
Yes.
be a little bit more passive.
Yes, exactly. Thank you, Daniel. Right? They're not willing to rebel. They're not willing to go against the flow. Right? They're going to acquiesce to the demands that are placed on them. Now, I put the parentheses in that because I disagree with that. Africans were fighting in Africa. Africans were fighting on the ship. Africans were fighting when they were placed in the Americas and in the Caribbean, right? So this idea of docility is a misnomer. But this is his argument, right? This is Bassett's argument, essentially. The features of the man, his hair, color, and diffidence, his subhuman characteristics so widely pleaded were only the later rationalizations to justify a simple fact that the colonies needed labor and resorted to the Negro labor because it was the cheapest and the best, right? That's really what this boils down to. You know, I think I got the wrong thing. We're not gonna, don't worry about that. You shouldn't even seen that. Yeah, I think I got the wrong thing. Yeah, bear with me, I'll skip through that. We don't need this. Okay, we'll come down here. All right, so chapter 2. So you have 1698, African Royal Company lost its monopoly of and the right of free trade in slaves. It was recognized as a fundamental nature and right of the Englishman. So remember in last week's conversation, right, I talked about while America was the location for enslavement, Europe had a very large presence in the process, right? This Royal African Company, that is a European institution that engaged in the slave trade, right? So with free trade and the increasing demands of the sugar plantation, the volume of British slave rose enormously. So because of the demand, they had to increase their activities in the enslavement process. The importation into Jamaica was, this is the amount of people who were being placed into these different colonies. I'm gonna move past this for sake of time. Yeah, we'll go past that too. Yeah, I don't want that. This is interesting, right? So he's talking about the culture of the institution of enslavement, right? This is not more so the practice, but the culture, right? He says little Black boys were the appendages of slave captains. What is an appendage? Can somebody help us understand this notion of an appendage?
Like we have appendages, like our arms, our legs.
Yes.
There's like an attachment to ourselves. They
Exactly.
are what we use to do things.
Exactly. So think about what Daniel said, right? So your arm could be considered an appendage. Your leg could be considered an appendage, right? It's an extension of your body that you use to accomplish tasks, right? So what Eric Williams is saying here, Black boys were the appendages of those who enslaved them, right? It was fashionable for ladies or women of easy virtue, right? So it was a thing of fashion, like a purse, right? Hogarth heroine, this is in the book, The Harlot's Progress, is attended by a Negro boy, and Marguerite Steens, and it's another character from a book. Arabella Brumsters typifies 18th century English opinion and her desire for a little Black boy whom she could love as her long-haired kitten, right? So this is how the children of the enslaved Africans were viewed, right, as pets, as like I said, purses, right? The equivalent to how you see these women walking around with little dogs in their purses, right? This is how they viewed African children. This is interesting as well. So the slave traders were among the leading humanitarians of the age. What is a humanitarian? What is a humanitarian? Or who could give me an example of a humanitarian in our age? Philanthropists could be the same thing. You guys are unfamiliar with humanitarian efforts or philanthropy?
It's someone who does things, that does efforts to advance like humanity, to like combat human rights violations. It's a way to, it's a social like advancement, so to speak. It's a humanitarian is someone who's actively engaging to right a wrong.
Right. So actively engaging to right a wrong, to fix an issue, right? To provide service to humanity, right? This is what a humanitarian is. Think about what this says. The slave traders were among the leading humanitarians of the age, right? So nothing could be more philanthropic than engaging in the process of human cargo, right? Think about how warped this society is. Think about, draw a distinction between how this society operates, where human beings can be viewed as purses, juxtaposed to what we read about the Kemetic society and the teachings of Ptah-hotep, and how Ma'at ordered the relations of individuals, right? John Kerry, advocate of the slave trade, was conspicuous for his integrity and humanity, and was the founder of a society known as the Incorporation of the Poor. So this is one of the humanitarians who engaged in the system of enslavement, but had this society, the Incorporation for the Poor. So while he was attending to the needs of the poor, he was taking enslaved Africans and placing them in forced labor, right? Before the American Revolution, English public opinion in general accepted the view of the slave trader, right? Thou to traffic in human creatures may at first sight appear though to traffic in human creatures may at first sight appear barbarous, inhumane, and unnatural, yet the traders herein have as much to plead in their own excuse as can be said for some other branches of the trade, namely the advantages of it. In a word, from this trade proceeds benefits far outweighing all either real or pretend mischief and inconvenience. So essentially what he's saying is, regardless of what the negative is of this institution of enslavement, the benefits outweigh the negative, right? So at the end, that the ends justify the means, so to speak. So I think when we talked about glissant and we talked about the open boat, and he mentions the underwater signposts that give you the trail from the west coast of Africa to the Americas. And I said that there's a memorial underwater in Grenada that is created to honor that underwater signpost. The image on the top right of the circle statues holding hands, that's the memorial that I mentioned that signifies that underwater signpost, right? Directly below that, this is what is called the door of no return. I believe that's in Ghana. What that is, on the inside of that door is an enslavement dungeon, right? Once you cross that door and you went outside of that dungeon, you were placed on the ship, and that way they say it's the no return, right? That's why they call it the door of no return. From there, you're going to the Western Hemisphere. And then obviously the African with his back mangled through the brutality that he experienced on the plantation, right? So this is also a way to think about the three abysses that Glissant was mentioning, right? The abyss of the water, right? The abyss of which you left behind in the door of no return, and then the abyss of the atrocities on the plantation system. So there's this notion called ma'afa, And Ma'afa is a Swahili term for great tragedy, right? So just kind of a little bit of information about the Ma'afa. I'm trying to get to some things that are pertinent. So when you talk about this idea of docility, and I said I want to push back against that, right? Here's one of the reasons why I say that this idea of them being docile does not fit. Of course, some Africans in this wretched condition committed suicide and sometimes even killed their infants rather than allow them to suffer enslavement. The whites were vigilant and trying to keep such incidents of self-mutilation and suicide quiet for the fear of spreading the word of such acts of resistance might cause them to be repeated elsewhere, right? So they wanted to stifle these acts of suicide and self-harm because they did not want these acts of subversion, these acts of resistance to enslavement to kind of pick up steam to other Africans. And then it would it would limit their ability to engage in this institution of enslavement, right? So these are acts of defiance. These are not because they're weak or not because they don't, they're too afraid to deal with the abyss that is coming. These are acts of defiance. And they understood that they would rather be one with the ancestors, right? They would be one with the afterlife, juxtaposed to having to experience this atrocity of enslavement. Here's another incident that kind of counters this notion of docility. It was, of course, the native Africans in particular whom the whites feared the most because the whites understood that they knew something else besides slavery, right? So they had something else to inform their reality, right? So they became the most dangerous. These Africans naturally maintained a much stronger historical memory and cultural identity than those Africans who were born into slavery, right? So think about what the system of enslavement does, right? It erases your memory. That's what the abyss that Glissant talks about, all that was left behind, right? Within losing your memory, you lose your sense of self, right? You lose what you're fighting for because this institution of enslavement becomes normative. It becomes your norm, right? So they recognize that ones that come straight from Africa are the most problematic because they had the most desire to fight and be free, right? So again, this idea of docility, I don't agree with. Second bullet point, African attacks were often mislabeled as Indian attacks because so many maroon African individuals and groups have formed very tight alliances with the so-called Native American groups. So this notion of maroon is very important, right? It's a theoretical framework that you could understand as maroonage, right? It's the ability to free yourself from the institution of enslavement and then set up a colony or set up a community of freed Africans, right? And oftentimes these maroon communities would be taken in by the Native Americans or by the indigenous, and they'll be, provided sanctuary, right? And oftentimes they would engage in strikes against the plantation system together. And so they would be misclassified as Indian attacks, but when in fact they were Africans, right? For those familiar with like the Seminole Indians, right? These are by and large African people who mixed and mingled with the indigenous people to produce this Seminole culture. So this is a pretty good bullet point too. A slave had no sense of himself that was separate from the self that the master wanted him to have. So think about the last slide, right? The distinction they drew between the native African enslaved and the enslaved who does not remember, his time in Africa. This is that slave that does not remember his time in Africa that's being depicted here, right? Thus, it was that no Black had a name of his own. He was given the surname of his owner, no matter how many owners he might have during his life. Second bullet point, religion also presented the slaves with the idea that they would receive their reward in heaven after they died. This appealed to their minds the idea of a suffering-free heaven after death because of the wretchedness of their current life condition of interminable suffering. So a way to think about this, these two bullet points. and I may have said this before, I'm not sure, but the three vestiges of enslavement are your name, your religion, and your language. Another way to think about this, the three vestiges of colonialism are your name, your language, and your religion, right? So before enslavement, we spoke African languages. Before enslavement, we had African names. Before enslavement, we had an African religion or African spiritual practices, right? After enslavement, we all spoke English. After enslavement, we all become Christians, right? After enslavement, we start taking up the last name Johnsons, Davis, Green, right? Black, because these are the last names of the plantation owner who we work for, right? So these are the three vestiges of enslavement. Same thing with colonialism, right? Before colonialism, you had native indigenous language. You had native indigenous names. You had native indigenous religions. After colonialism, everyone spoke English or Spanish, right? Everyone had European names, right? Everyone had Catholic religion or Christian religion, right? So these are the three vestiges of enslavement and colonialism. So again, this notion of fugitivity, right? It becomes of great importance, and it also serves as a framework. Fugitive slaves or fugitivity, Africans who have escaped from the plantation and were at large, become powerful source, if not the most powerful source of persistence and protracted resistance to enslavement among the Africans. When Africans rebelled and escaped, they typically took weapons such as guns and knives, as well as tools and provisions. Thus, plans to sustain themselves and defend their freedom were a regular part of insurrection activity. It is also true that the killing of whites was also a frequent aspect of African slave revolts, as opposed to being only occasionally or incidental occurrence. I missed that last part because it's kind of covered up. But again, this notion of being fugitive, this notion of fugitivity, right? It counters this claim that African peoples were docile, right? So this notion of maroonage and fugitivity also serves as a framework to understand how Africans resisted the institution of enslavement. All right. So I know that was a lot in a little bit of time, and I really don't like giving lectures, but I wanted you guys to kind of situate some of that information because it wasn't in the reading. With the last 10 minutes that we have, let's talk about either what you read or what was covered in the lecture for the past half hour. Again, we'll open dialogue. There's no set form, but just anything you want to share as it pertains to what you read, what you discussed in your breakout group, or what was mentioned in the lecture. And let's give Daniel a break because he's the only one commenting throughout the lecture. So anyone besides Daniel. Thank you though, Daniel.
What we talked about in our breakout room, for me, like this reading, it was just the way I understood it was that Britain wanted to keep their name clear of the atrocities that occurred. And to me, like my question is, was that like the main reason why they wanted to keep their name away from what they did in the first place, or was there some greater reason on that? But that was just my thoughts.
Yeah. It is definitely you're on the right track in the sense they wanted to keep the name clean, right? Public opinion has shifted in the way that enslavement was viewed, and they didn't want to have their reality sullied by their activity in the enslaved process, right? Even if you think about Europe now, because of that, they try to distance themselves from like racism, like, oh, we don't experience racism here, right? Like, y'all, there's a race problem in America, but here, not so much, right? But what you're starting to see, especially within the past 10 years, because of the influx of migrants from Africa into Europe, right? They're starting to deal with this issue of a race problem. It's really starting to come to bear. Also, in the early 80s, in the UK in particular, there's this moment of Thatcherism. So Margaret Thatcher becomes the, it's not a president in Europe, whatever, the prime minister. right? But at the same time that Thatcher takes office, a lot of migrants from the Caribbean and Africa are starting to come into Europe, right? And you're starting to see these rash of violence against the Caribbean and African migrants into Europe, right? So while Europe prides itself on not being like America in its practice of racism because they were able to kind of pull away a little bit before America did, it doesn't absolve them of their racist history, right? As we read in the lecture, they were the premier distributors in the process of enslavement, right? Good question, Francisco. Anybody else?
I want to say something. After reading this and some, research, I feel that slavery actually played a very major role in making making Britain prosperous. And the high profits on slavery helped finance the British Industrial Revolution. So British capital actually gained the extra value from the unpaid work by the slave. So that's the whole system, and this system actually lasts for a couple of centuries. And this is how the Western world become like this, because they're standing on top of the slavers' unpaid work.
Absolutely, Cecilia. Like you hit the nail on the head. Absolutely. So there's this there's a saying,
and I have another, because it's an interesting thought in my head. I was like, so if there's no technology, there's no industrial revolution at that time, if this whole world is still remain agricultural, will they remain the slavery still? That's what I'm thinking, because the Industrial Revolution actually moved the Western world from agriculture to the capitalism, so manufacturing. Yeah. So that's why they don't need the slavery anymore, because they do less agricultural work compared to before. So that's why they want to get rid of it. They want to forget it, basically.
Yeah, good point, Cecilia. So essentially what she's saying is, right, there was a shift that took place from the world's economic system being funded through agricultural institutions to industrial institutions. And when that shift took place, slavery was no longer useful, right? And yeah, that's another reason why Britain was ready to pull away from enslavement, because they had already started their process of the Industrial Revolution, right? America's was a little bit later. So yes, she's spot on in her assessment that if it was not a need for that shift to go into the Industrial Revolution, we may still be in the system of enslavement, right? Another point that Cecilia makes is the whole Western world was financed through the institution of enslavement, right? So when you think about what they call like third world countries, right? Africa is considered a third world country. A large part of South America is considered a third world country. Certain parts of Asia are considered third world countries, right? All of these third world countries are third world because first world countries have pillaged and plummeted all their resources, right? If we use the example of Africa, one of my favorite ancestors, Kwame Ture, or Stokely Carmichael, who you may know him as, he says, there's a contradiction of Africa, that Africa is the richest place in the world, the richest land with the poorest people, right? And that institution of enslavement has instituted that process, right? Because they took all of Africa's resources, the first resources being the human resource, right? Taking human cargo, right? And then from there, they took diamonds, they took gold, they took rubber, they took ivory, the list goes on, right? Everyone who has an iPhone, who has a computer, you cannot run these devices without coltan. Coltan comes from the Congo, right? So the pillaging of African resources, it still continues to this day, right? The world has not stopped running off of African resources. We just don't go through the process of enslavement anymore because we're not an agricultural society, to Cecilia's point, right? So now they're steering, like, so where do you think majority of the world's oil comes from? Africa, right? The Middle East, right? So the dependency on so-called third world countries has not left the Western world. The Western world would not be the power that it is without its dependency on so-called third world countries. So that's a phenomenal point, Cecilia. Let's have one more.
Also,
Go ahead.
as like a, like, I'm not sure how to word it, as like maybe a separate view. I would disagree in Cecilia's point only in that I don't think slavery is over, in the sense all it's done, it's morphed.
Yeah.
It's changed slightly. It's still the same institution. It's just taken on a different face. There's a great documentary, I think it's the name 13,
Yeah.
where all it's done is get into prisons. Prisons which are predominantly people of color are, and you see what they do, they actually put them to work. They force them to work, and it's unpaid labor. They're getting pennies on the dollar, and there's multiple different capitalistic large businesses that are benefiting from it. And you look at the very establishment in place when it comes to the law, judges, and how the people are persecuted, and how the sentencing goes about, and how severe the sentencing is. You can see that the severity of sentencing towards African and people of color is way worse than it would be for a Caucasian.
Yeah.
Well, there was, I'm forgetting who said it, but there was a brilliant quote I read a while back that said, "The greatest threat to the black man is a police officer. The greatest threat to a black woman is a healthcare professional."
Nah, Daniel, thank you for problematizing further, right? And I would even say that I don't think that you and Cecilia's comments are in conflict or in tension. You're just building on her assertion, right? It's just the fact that we can't get comfortable in this idea that because it was almost 6 centuries ago, that this institution is over with, right? It's just changed. I'm gonna point to 2 references and we'll call it a day. So Frantz Fanon he's a Martinican from the same place as Glissant, trained in France, brilliant revolutionary scholar, theoretician, right? And he has this chapter in a book called Towards the African Revolution, I believe it's in that book. The chapter is called Racism and Culture, right? And he talks about how racism and culture inform one another, right? So when culture shifts, racism shifts to fit that culture, right? And then when racism shifts, culture shifts to fit that racism. So they're like 2 entities that work together and adjust with one another. So racism never goes away, it just changes the way that it orientates itself, right? Another resource that I'm thinking about is this brother from the continent, from Africa. I want to say Congo, I could be wrong. But his name is Achille Mbembe, and he has this book called Negro Politics, Necro, Necro, like death, right? So essentially we're saying the politics of death. And what his claim and his argument is how in the early 19th century and late 18th century, right, enslavement had a very racialized basis to it, right? So, and what we just kind of covered now, eventually ended up where the Africans were the ones who were enslaved. But what Mbembe is claiming through necropolitics is the modern day enslavement institution has no racial basis to it. It's whether you're financially available or able to sustain yourself or not, right? If you're financially able to commodify yourself, then you could avoid the capture of enslavement. If you don't, then you're going to end up being in an institution of enslavement. And I'm going to put this one to you guys. The notion of wage slavery. What do you think of when you hear wage slavery? What do you think that means? And this goes to Mbembe's point. What is your wage?
Wage is what you make in an hour.
Wage is what you make in an hour. So if
and
I'm
when
saying,
you look at,
go ahead.
no, for full, right?
I was going to say, so if we're looking at wage slavery, what does that mean?
Like, I would interpret it as, well, look at what they're paying you. Look at what they're paying for a minimum wage job. It's ridiculous. You expect people you expect people to live off these wages when it comes to providing for your family, providing housing, providing healthcare. It's impossible. It's physically impossible.
Absolutely. So that's one aspect of it, right? They're very minimal wages. But even for those who making 100,000, making 200,000, you're still within this concept of wage slavery. And here's why. You're making 200,000, you got a mortgage, you got a car note, you got insurance, you got phone bills, right? So in the event that that wage stops, you lose your home, you lose your car, phone's is gone, right? So you're enslaved to maintaining that wage to maintain your lifestyle, right? So while Daniel's spot on, the minimum wage is unlivable, right? But even those who make well beyond minimum wage are still tied to that wage because they need it for their survival, because they created a lifestyle that they want to maintain and they got comfortable with. So they're going to make sure that they're at that job Monday through Friday for 40 hours a week, and they're getting that wage because that sustains their lifestyle. So now we're not only being slave to, from our standpoint of our time, but we're also slave to material objects, right? You want to have your wage, you can buy more shit, right? This also goes behind this notion of wage slavery. So if we were to take that concept with what Mbembe is talking about, Negro politics, everyone is becoming a slave. That's what he's talking about, right? Unless you could what? Commodify yourself. And that's where you have like these influencers where they're making monetary gain off of themselves, right? That's the only way out, Mbembe says, from this wage enslavement. So we'll put a pause there. Let me show you guys the readings for next time. Also, there is an extra credit assignment this Thursday. I placed it on the Google Classroom site. I'll be doing another guest lecture at Antioch University on Thursday at 5:30. We'll be discussing the Harlem Renaissance. And I'm gonna kind of bring a alternative perspective on the Harlem Renaissance. Bear with me 1 second while I pull up your reading for next week, and we'll call it a day. If you guys have any questions while I do that, feel free. Okay. So we will be also watching the documentary 13th that Daniel was referencing earlier. Okay, so this will be our next reading. M. Gomez, Reversing Slave. I'm sorry, Reversing Cell, excuse me. Yeah, I think, okay, we should be good. So the other way, you don't have to read through that. The reading stops here. So once you get to the other way, you're done. That starts another section. So from games people play all the way through another way. That'll be the reading that we'll complete for this coming week. If I have time and if I remember, I'll send that out via email on Friday. Again, Thursday, there's extra credit opportunity. And then for next week, we'll get back to our normal flow. We'll have our fishbowl, we'll have our breakout groups, and then I'll provide context, and I'll kind of get us back to how we normally process things. Other than that, are there any questions, comments, or concerns for me?